35 years after a Miami couple was murdered, the man who killed them is set to be executed.
As the clock neared 6 p.m. on September 30th, 2025, a tense hush fell over the execution chamber at Florida State Prison. Victor Tony Jones, 64 years old, gone from decades on death row, lay strapped to a gurney, about to face the same fate he had dealt to his victims decades earlier. 35 years ago, just before Christmas 1990, Jones had brutally stabbed a Miami couple to death in cold blood during a robbery. Now, with witnesses watching from behind a glass pane, the final chapter of that horrific crime was about to close in the most somber way imaginable. Welcome to Deadline Files. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Your support means a great deal, and it keeps these important stories alive. In December 1990, Victor Tony Jones was a recently hired hand at a small family business in Miami's Wynwood neighborhood, a medical supply and engineering shop owned by Jacob Jack Nestor, 67, and his wife Matilda Dolly Nestor, 66. The Nestors were pillars of their community, known for their generosity and willingness to help others. They had immigrated to America decades earlier, working tirelessly to build their modest business from the ground up. Their shop was more than just a livelihood. It was a testament to the American dream, a place where they served hospitals and nursing homes with essential medical equipment and repair services. The Nestors trusted Jones with odd jobs around the shop, not knowing the danger they had let in. They paid him fairly and treated him with respect, as they did everyone who came through their doors. To them, offering someone work was an act of Christian charity, a way to help a person get back on their feet. They had no way of knowing that their kindness would be repaid with unspeakable violence. In a shocking betrayal just days before Christmas, Jones turned on his employers. The attack happened on a quiet December afternoon when the shop was preparing to close for the day. He attacked the elderly couple inside their store, plunging a knife into Matilda's neck and stabbing Jacob in the chest during what prosecutors later described as a robbery gone wrong. The scene was nothing short of bloody and brutal, an act of ruthless violence against two people who had given Jones work and kindness. Investigators would later piece together the horrifying sequence of events. Jones had apparently been planning the robbery, waiting for an opportunity when the shop would have cash on hand but few customers around. He struck with sudden, savage efficiency, using a knife he had brought specifically for this purpose. The violence was extreme and personal, suggesting either panic or rage, or perhaps both. But the Nestors did not surrender without a fight. Mortally wounded, Jacob Nestor fought back with remarkable tenacity. Despite the terrible pain and shock of being stabbed near his heart, the 67-year-old man refused to simply die. In what would become his final act of courage and defiance, he staggered to his office despite a stab wound near his heart, managed to grab his .22 caliber pistol, and fired 5 shots at Jones. One bullet struck Jones squarely in the forehead, knocking him down and leaving him wounded. The gunshots rang out in the quiet Miami neighborhood, alerting nearby shop owners that something terrible had happened. Within minutes, police sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder as patrol cars raced toward the scene. By the time authorities arrived, they found a bloody scene. Jacob and Matilda Nestor lay dead or dying in pools of their own blood, and Jones himself was injured and bleeding from the head, dazed from the bullet that had struck his skull. Crucially, police discovered Jones carrying the couple's cash and personal belongings in his pockets, evidence of the robbery that had precipitated the killings. The husband's courageous last act had not only wounded the killer, it helped ensure that Jones was caught red-handed at the scene of the crime. Paramedics rushed to save the Nestors, but it was too late. Matilda had died almost instantly from the catastrophic wound to her neck. Jacob, despite his incredible fight, succumbed to his injuries shortly after arriving at the hospital. The knife had pierced too close to his heart, and even the 20 minutes he had managed to survive while fighting back proved insufficient for medical help to arrive in time. 2 lives snuffed out in an instant of greed and violence, just days before they would have celebrated Christmas with their daughter and grandchildren. Jones was arrested on the spot and eventually recovered from his head wound, paving the way for justice to be served. The bullet that struck his forehead had miraculously deflected off his skull rather than penetrating his brain, leaving him with a permanent scar but no life-threatening damage. As he recovered in a hospital bed under armed guard, detectives built an airtight case against him. The evidence was overwhelming. His fingerprints were throughout the crime scene, the victim's blood was on his clothes, and their money and valuables were in his possession. There were no other suspects, no room for doubt. In 1993, a Florida jury convicted Victor Tony Jones on 2 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Jacob and Matilda Nestor, as well as 2 counts of armed robbery. The trial lasted several weeks, during which prosecutors painted a damning picture of premeditated violence and callous disregard for human life. Defense attorneys attempted to portray Jones as a desperate man driven to a terrible act by poverty and circumstance, but the brutality of the crime and the clear evidence left little doubt. The jury deliberated for less than a day before returning with guilty verdicts on all counts. During the penalty phase, jurors heard heart-wrenching testimony from the Nestor's daughter Irene and their grandchildren, who described the devastating impact of losing both beloved family members in such a horrific manner. They learned about Jacob's final moments, fighting for his life and his wife's life even as he bled out. They saw crime scene photographs that showed the terrible violence of the attack. In the end, jurors sentenced Jones to death for his crimes, determining that the aggravating factors, the brutality, the robbery motive, the murder of 2 elderly victims, far outweighed any mitigating circumstances. Jones would spend the next 3 decades on death row, filing appeals and awaiting his fate. Life on death row is a strange existence, a limbo between life and death where time stretches out endlessly. Jones lived in a small cell, typically spending 23 hours a day in isolation, allowed out only for brief periods of exercise in a small cage or for occasional meetings with attorneys and spiritual advisors. He ate alone, slept alone, and waited alone for a date with death that seemed to perpetually recede into the distant future. Over the years, his legal team raised numerous challenges, at one point claiming he had an intellectual disability or that he had suffered abuse in his youth, but courts ultimately upheld his death sentence each time. Appeals court judges reviewed the case from every possible angle, examining whether his trial had been fair, whether his attorneys had been competent, whether new evidence might exonerate him or reduce his culpability. Each time, they came to the same conclusion. The conviction was sound, the sentence was appropriate, and no legal error warranted overturning the jury's decision. By 2025, all appeals had been exhausted. The legal system had run its course through every level of state and federal courts. In late September of that year, the U.S. Supreme Court declined to intervene with any last-minute stay, clearing the final obstacle for Jones's execution. Governor Ron DeSantis signed the death warrant, officially scheduling Jones's execution for September 30th, 2025. After 35 years of waiting, justice would finally be served. On the day of his execution, Victor Jones awoke at 4:30 a.m. inside Florida State Prison, beginning the last day of his life. He was moved to a special holding cell near the execution chamber, a place reserved for condemned inmates in their final hours. Prison officials noted that Jones remained calm and compliant as the hours ticked by. There were no outbursts, no desperate pleas, no last-minute confessions. He seemed resigned to his fate, perhaps even at peace with it after so many years of waiting. He met with a spiritual advisor in the morning, spending quiet moments in prayer or reflection with the minister, who came to comfort him. The chaplain read scriptures, offered prayers, and listened as Jones spoke about his regrets and his hopes for whatever came next. These conversations remained confidential, a final private moment between a condemned man and his God. Unlike some condemned inmates who receive visits from family or friends on their final day, Jones had no other visitors aside from the prison chaplain. His family, if he had any remaining connections, chose not to come. Perhaps they were estranged, or perhaps they simply couldn't bear to watch him die. Whatever the reason, Jones would face his final hours largely alone, without the comfort of familiar faces or loving words from relatives. The prison administration followed established protocols for the final day. Guards checked on Jones every 15 minutes, documenting his behavior and mental state. A doctor examined him to ensure he was fit for execution, an ironic medical procedure meant to verify that he was healthy enough to be killed. Legal representatives made final phone calls, confirming that no last-minute stays or reprieves had been issued. Outside the prison, a small group of death penalty opponents held a candlelight vigil, praying for Jones's soul and protesting the state-sanctioned killing, while others stood in support of the execution, holding signs demanding justice for the Nestors. As the afternoon wore on, Jones was offered the customary privilege of a final meal of his choosing. He requested a modest but classic Southern feast: fried chicken, collard greens, and sweet tea. In Florida, as in many states, condemned prisoners can pick a last meal within a reasonable budget and availability, and Jones took the opportunity for a bit of comfort food. He ate his meal quietly in his cell under guard, with the knowledge that it would be his last supper on earth. Prison officials reported that he ate most of the food, savoring each bite before pushing the tray aside. After the meal, there was nothing left to do but wait for the appointed hour. Shortly after 6 p.m. on September 30th, 2025, Victor Tony Jones was escorted into the brightly lit execution chamber. He walked under his own power, flanked by correctional officers, his legs shackled but his demeanor composed. He was wearing prison-issue clothing, and his face bore the weathered lines of a man who had aged behind bars. He was placed on a padded gurney, his arms outstretched in a cruciform position and secured with leather straps. Prison officials inserted 4 lines in preparation for the lethal drugs, first attempting his right arm, then his left when the first insertion proved difficult. The execution chamber was a carefully choreographed space where every detail had been planned and rehearsed. Witnesses sat behind thick glass, unable to hear what was said inside the chamber unless a microphone was turned on. A telephone hung on the wall, connected directly to the governor's office in case of a last-minute reprieve. Medical personnel stood ready, hidden behind a one-way mirror, prepared to administer the lethal injection sequence. Before the lethal chemicals began to flow, the warden asked Jones if he had any final words or a last statement. The gathered witnesses leaned forward, awaiting a response. Some condemned inmates used their final words to proclaim innocence, others to express remorse, still others to share messages of love with family members. Jones's reply was a simple, polite refusal. "No, sir," he said, offering nothing more. These 2 curt words were the last he ever spoke. At 6 p.m. the drugs were administered, and as the first chemical, a powerful sedative, entered his bloodstream, Jones's chest heaved repeatedly for a minute or 2. Then the movement gradually slowed until it ceased altogether. The 3-drug cocktail followed its grim sequence. First the sedative to render him unconscious, then a paralytic to stop his breathing, and finally a drug to stop his heart. An official stepped forward to check on the inmate, shaking Jones and calling his name to see if there was any response. There was none. A medical examiner then entered the chamber, listened for a heartbeat or breath with a stethoscope, checked his pupils, and at 6:13 p.m. declared Victor Jones dead. Officials later reported that the procedure went without complications, a clinical phrase meant to convey that everything had proceeded according to protocol. After 35 years, the sentence of death had finally been carried out.
I do forgive him. I forgive him because it's important for me to forgive him. I won't forget it.
In the witness gallery that evening sat Irene Fisher, the only daughter of Jacob and Matilda Nestor. Now in her 70s, Irene had waited more than half her life for this moment of justice. She traveled to Florida with her 2 adult daughters and other family members to be present at Jones's execution. "I'm 76 years old, and I didn't think I'd be alive to see it," Irene admitted in the days leading up to the execution. But when the opportunity came, she decided she needed to witness the man who killed her parents take his last breath. The prison provided a front row seat for the Nestor family in the viewing room, and no one from Jones's own family was in attendance on the other side of the glass. It was an extraordinary, somber gathering, the end of a long and painful journey for the victims' loved ones. Irene sat with her hands folded in her lap, her face a mask of composure that barely concealed the roiling emotions beneath. Watching an execution is not easy, even when the person dying is the one who caused immeasurable pain. Irene Fisher later confessed to feeling mixed emotions as she watched the lethal injection unfold. It was the first time in her life she had seen a person die, and the experience was emotionally intense. As Jones slipped away peacefully on the gurney, Irene couldn't help but think of her own parents' final moments. She remarked on the almost gentle nature of his death compared to what her mother and father endured. "After seeing what I saw tonight, I wish my parents had that opportunity to die so gracefully. Close your eyes and just go," Irene said solemnly. "They were violently killed. My father fought for 20 minutes with a stab wound in his heart, and my mother died instantly on a cold floor," she recalled, her voice filled with the lingering horror of that night in 1990. The contrast between Jones's calm, clinical execution and the terrifying violence that Jacob and Matilda suffered could not have been more stark. For Irene and her family, seeing Jones's execution brought a measure of closure that had been elusive for decades. "I'm just glad it's finally over," she said, expressing relief that the long-delayed sentence was finally carried out and justice had been served. In an extraordinary show of grace, Irene even found it in her heart to forgive the man who took her parents' lives.
I do forgive him. I forgive him because it's important for me to forgive him. I won't forget it.
"I absolutely forgive him," she told a local reporter afterward. "He's done. I never have to hear his name again." With Jones's death, Irene felt she could at last let go of the shadow he had cast over her family. For 35 years, his name had been a dark presence in their lives, appearing in legal documents and news stories, a constant reminder of the worst day they had ever experienced. Every appeal, every court hearing, every postponed execution date had reopened old wounds. Now finally, it was finished. Victor Tony Jones's execution was the 13th execution in Florida in 2025, a year that saw the state set a modern record for its use of the death penalty. By comparison, the previous high was 8 executions in a single year in Florida, and no other state had reached the same number in 2025. This grim milestone reflects a broader push in the state to carry out long-pending death sentences, as Florida worked through a backlog of condemned inmates who had exhausted their appeals. The increase in executions sparked debate throughout Florida and beyond. Death penalty opponents argued that the accelerated pace raised concerns about due process and the risk of executing innocent people. They pointed to cases nationwide where condemned inmates had been exonerated after years on death row, sometimes just days before their scheduled executions. Supporters of capital punishment countered that justice delayed is justice denied, and that families of victims deserved to see sentences carried out rather than delayed indefinitely by endless appeals. But for the family of Jacob and Matilda Nestor, those broader policy debates were secondary. What truly mattered to them was finally seeing justice done. After 35 years, the man who brutally ended 2 innocent lives had met his fate. In the words of Irene Fisher, the execution meant she would never have to hear his name again, and that the painful story of her parents' murder could at last be laid to rest. The case of Victor Tony Jones represents both the promise and the tragedy of the criminal justice system. Justice was served. A guilty man was held accountable for his terrible crimes. Yet that justice took 35 years to arrive, long enough that the victim's daughter feared she might die before seeing it carried out. The wheels of justice turn slowly, perhaps too slowly for those who wait for closure. As witnesses filed out of the prison that September evening, the sun had already set, leaving the facility bathed in harsh floodlights. Irene Fisher walked to her car, surrounded by her daughters, ready to return home and begin the process of truly moving forward. Behind them, inside the prison, guards were already cleaning the execution chamber, preparing it for the next use. And somewhere in the prison's death row unit, other condemned inmates awaited their own dates with destiny, knowing that what happened to Victor Jones would someday happen to them. The story of Victor Tony Jones, Jacob Nestor, and Matilda Nestor is a reminder of the terrible ripple effects of violence. One brutal act in December 1990 destroyed not just 2 lives, but shattered a family, traumatized a community, and set in motion a 35-year legal odyssey that consumed countless hours and resources. In the end, justice was done, but no one truly won. The Nestors remained dead, their grandchildren grew up without them, and Jones paid for his crimes with his own life. All that remained was the hope that their story might serve as a cautionary tale, a reminder of the precious fragility of life and the terrible cost of violence.